Right, but now it's time for World View, and today we have an exclusive interview on our show. So first, let's go for our first stop. Let's head to Moscow, to Russia. So thousands of Russian protesters have taken to the streets to demonstrate against the government's mobilisation of men. Now, this is the country's first draft since the Second World War and has caused unprecedented chaos and outrage across the whole of Russia. Since Putin's announcements, the reality of war has finally hit home with ordinary Russian people. And meanwhile, Moscow has said that the mobilisation would aid in Russia's attempt at unifying territories it holds in Ukraine. And those protesting against the war, protesting against it, face 5 years of imprisonment in accordance with the war. I spoke to one of those protesters who was brave enough to risk her life in Moscow to stand up to the Kremlin.
I wouldn't want to be tortured or raped or put in jail. But I'm not afraid of this. They punish anti-war protesters very severely.
Tell us a bit about what happened to you during the protests.
I was really upset about mobilization, although it had been expected. I went to protest that evening. We all linked each other arm in arm. In Russia, we try not to touch police because they can put you in prison for 5 years. So we tried not to put our hands on them, but also not allow each other to be arrested. My arrest was really rough. I fell a few times. 4 of them carried me away because I tried to resist. I don't remember if they beat me or not in detention. I remember that I screamed and that they closed my mouth. But when I came home, I found bruises all over my body. When we arrived at the station, they immediately took away our phones and gave the men their military draft summons to report to the Army Recruitment Centre. They gave the men their papers to report there, and if the government decides, they can be sent to war.
Are you scared for your safety?
People are really scared to protest because the police have to jail a certain number of people every time. It's frightening for people because the state monitors and carries out surveillance on those who are anti-war. For public dissemination of false information, you can be jailed for 5 years. And for discrediting the Russian army, you can be jailed for 15. People are very scared to say anything due to the fear of prison. They will jail someone certainly, but we can't be sure who, because it's like a public execution, to show others what can happen if you step out of line.
What's the mood like in Russia now?
Every day and even today, I hear conversations of everyday people in the street and on buses about mobilization, about the annexation of Ukrainian territory by Russia. Propaganda isn't coping. In Russia, propaganda is very strong. Those older than 40 get their information from the TV, where there is no freedom, just propaganda. There's no information. The government suffocates all media that opposes them. Young people who use the internet understand what's going on. Practically all of them are against the war. But the thing is, there is no democracy. We cannot choose a new government. Our election system doesn't work. There's just a facade of elections, but there are none. It doesn't exist in Russia. Orwell wrote 1984 about the Soviet Union, but we're in it again. We have no freedom. We can't decide anything.
That was Polina Chistova. She's a student and an activist who risked her life to protest against mobilisation in Russia. I spoke to her just yesterday. Well, to tell us more, I'm joined by political commentator Danny Armstrong, who also worked as a journalist in Russia. So, Danny, I mean, talk me through this. A lot of people are actually trying to get out of Russia now, and there are, as Polina said, there's a lot of young people who are really protesting against the war. So there's a real energy against this war, but it's the elder generation who seem to be all for it.
Of course, young people are leaving Russia in their tens of thousands. I think more than 100,000 across the border into Kazakhstan. I think around the same number into Georgia, and of course you have to factor in the countries also to the west of Russia. They're trying to escape. Of course, some go to protests. These protests are arrested, put in the back of a police van, and then served their draft summons. They're leaving to escape that, but also to escape the pressure from the older generation. There have been reports, people that I've personally spoke to, who have said that their parents have encouraged them to actually answer the draft summons. People who have actually left the country, they said, come back, fill in your obligation to your country, go to the commissariat, the recruitment centre, and go to the front line. I mean, this is what they're trying to escape in Russia. Hopefully it goes some way to showing people in the West that there is a huge population out there in Russia that are against this war. They've been against it since February 24th, even before that, when there were murmurs of an invasion. And they have carried that right the way through to mobilisation and the annexation of the 4 regions in Ukraine.
What's your general thoughts then on how this war will sort of go, in your view? Do you think it's something that may end up ending quite soon, or do you feel that this is a long graft?
I don't really think the end is in sight anytime soon. I would go as far to say as Vladimir Putin has backed himself into a corner somewhat. It can't really be understated, the lack of support he's had from even Eastern allies. Of course, we've seen Western condemnation for the war, annexation and mobilisation was expected, but there are countries like India, China and Turkey that have also condemned it. So it's very significant. He's painted himself into a corner internationally.
Well, that's worrying. Danny, thank you very much for joining me. That's Danny Armstrong. He's a political commentator. Right, now let's head over to the United States to find out about the US reaction to all the events taking place in Russia. I'm now joined by the host of the Politics People podcast, Paul Dudderidge. Paul, so what's the reaction to the mobilisation for the Americans? Are the Americans aware of what's going on? A lot of the time, it seems the American people aren't really engaged in what's going on with this war. Are they actually interested in what's happening?
They're certainly interested up to a point. America has got a history of feeling like it's been dragged into European wars, and there's a lot of resentment towards that, to just be taken for granted. This is the people I'm talking about. And it's interesting, there was a poll released, reported in Newsweek just yesterday, that says that 57% of likely voters actually want any aid and assistance to Ukraine tied to a diplomatic approach. And that doesn't fit with Washington's current approach, which is purely military and doesn't engage any idea of diplomacy or agreements. These 57% are in this recent poll are saying that the aid, $16 billion so far, another billion this week has been given to Ukraine, that Ukraine should actually make compromise. Now, that's completely at odds with what's coming out of Washington. So we're beginning to see fractures and splits, if you like, in the consensus in the United States.
Paul, do you think that NATO are likely to intervene?
Yes, in short, I think they're going to. I think that Washington, basically Washington is a proxy for NATO and vice versa. And as long as this administration is keen on a military resolution, and solely a military resolution, then NATO has to be involved. I can't see how that's going to be avoidable.
If it does escalate in that way, how do you think the US will react?
Well, former Vice President Joe Biden this week has made it very clear that after Putin's more, the extended saber rattling and invoking nuclear, former Vice President Biden has made it very clear that it will be matched and met with commensurate force. So I think that the word out of Washington and the word from the administration, there really is no doubt at all that it will be met militarily. And so Americans, the average American knows that they will be used for boots on the ground at some point, or feels that. And again, that's just me. That's my sort of local horse sense about talking to actual Americans. But it actually seems to be the strategy coming out of Washington, that this thing is being amped up. It's not the fault of Washington. It's their response to it. Does not include diplomacy at this point. And that can only mean, I believe, a military outcome.